In our continuing focus of comparative theodicy and eschatologies, in today's back cover book report, I'd like to recommend and reflect upon Marjorie Hewitt Sukoki's work entitled The End of Evil, Process Eschatology in Historical Context. Before we dive into this book and all it entails in the category of philosophical theology and theodicy slash eschatology, I want to read a quote from the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy, a paragraph entitled The Logical Problem of Evil. And this logical problem of evil is something that classical theism is still apparently wrestling with, more so, I would say, than the process panentheistic viewpoint, which tends to solve the problem of evil more readily, perhaps, than the classical theists' omni-gods position. The logical problem of evil, the existence of evil and suffering in our world, seems to pose a serious challenge to belief in the existence of a perfect God. It is as posited by classical theism. If God were all-knowing, it seems that God would know about all of the horrible things that happen in our world. If God were all-powerful, omnipotent, God would be able to do something about all of the evil and suffering. Furthermore, if God were morally perfect, then surely God would want to do something about it. And yet, we find that our world is filled with countless instances of evil and suffering. These facts about evil and suffering seem to conflict with the orthodox theist claim that there exists a perfectly good God. The challenge posed by this apparent conflict has come to be known as the problem of evil. This article addresses one form of the problem that is prominent in recent philosophical discussions, that the conflict that exists between the claims of orthodox theism and the facts about evil and suffering in our world is a logical one. This is the logical problem of evil. So, this encyclopedic article clarifies the nature of the logical problem of evil and considers various theistic responses to the problem. Special attention is given to the free will defense, which has been the most widely discussed theistic response to the logical problem of evil. So comparatively, in my opinion, the process model of theodicy deals more adequately with the problem of evil than does the classical model or theodicy proposed by orthodox theists. As process theodicy is highly philosophical, more so perhaps than classical theism. Marjorie Hewitt Sukoki, the author of The End of Evil in Process, Eschatology, and Historical Context, was born in 1933, is an author and United Methodist professor of theology at Claremont School of Theology. She also is co-director of the Center for Process Studies at Claremont. Sukoki earned a Bachelor of Arts degree in philosophy from Sonoma College in 1970, and both Master of Arts and Doctor of Philosophy degrees in religion from Claremont Graduate School in 1974. She taught at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary from 77 to 83, and from 1983 to 1990, she was Professor of Systematic Theology and Dean of Wesley Theological Seminary. In 1990, Sukoki returned to Claremont School of Theology, where she held the endowed Ingram Chair in Theology and joint appointment at the Claremont Graduate School until her retirement in 2002. She has held visiting professorships at Vanderbilt University in 1996 and 1999, and at the Rupert Karl University of Heidelberg in Heidelberg, Germany in 1992. Since 2001, Sukoki has been director of the Whitehead International Film Festival. She is considered, along with John B. Cobb and David Ray Griffin, as one of the leaders in the field of process theology. A list of her works, although not exhaustive, is as follows: In God's Presence, God, Christ, Church, a practical guide to process theology, that which I would recommend as well. Divinity and Diversity, a Christian affirmation of religious pluralism. A Whispered Word, a Theology of Preaching and Reconstructing Christian Theology. Also, 21 Psalms for the 21st Century, a process. Meditation. Also, Through a Lens Darkly, Tracing Redemption in Film. And now on to a description of The End of Evil, Process Eschatology in Historical Context. From the back cover we read, the topic of evil and redemption has been at the center of the Western tradition since the beginning of the Christian era. In The End of Evil, Sukoki explores the source and end of evil in the thought of Augustine, Leibniz, Kant, Schleiermacher, Hegel, and Nietzsche, as well as Whitehead. Whitehead's philosophy is used as a creative response to the problems and possibilities raised in these earlier developments. This is a major piece of scholarship. It is clearly and gracefully written, far from merely summarizing existing process approaches in eschatology. Sukoki intricately works out, for the first time, a systematic treatment of the source and end of evil. The topics of evil, of theodicy, of eschatology, central concerns of Christian theology, receive a systematic treatment here from both an historical and philosophical perspective, perhaps a perspective that tends to lack in Orthodox classical traditional theism. This makes this book more than a theological exercise. At the same time, it rises above much current philosophical literature by focusing on categories of existence under or rather than language such as freedom and finitude, treated in terms of a unified theory. I believe her explanation of the Whiteheadian basis for this particular process eschatology will be an important, not to say popular, interpretation. Nancy Frankenberry, Professor of Religion, Dartmouth College. I particularly admire Sokoki's historical sense. She lodges the problem of evil in the development of the Western tradition and treats a variety of extremely different contexts from Augustine to Nietzsche, extremely different to say the least, with core and, with care and competence, as her own view, which is of course an excursion of Whitehead's, or an extension rather, begins to unfold in the second half of the book. It is enriched and clarified by her account of the background out of which she understands it to have emerged. I was also impressed by Sokoki's ability to maintain a successful tension between her own religious commitments frankly stated in the introduction and as a rigorous, disinterested philosophical analysis. Brian J. Martin, author of Indeterminacy and Intelligibility. So now I'll read some of the text. I'll be reading the introduction as well as the conclusion of the book and a small portion of the midsection to give you an idea as to the importance of this great work concerning the problem of evil in theodicy and comparative theology and religions. Introduction. From The End of Evil, Process Eschatology in Historical Context. In the midst of the sorrows of history, religious thinkers have sought the reason and resolution of these sorrows at the edges of history. In protology and eschatology, how is it that terror and tragedy are woven into the fabric of our lives? Can the irrational within history find irrational explanation beyond history? If the thinker can locate a reason for the problematic nature of history in a prehistorical cause, there is yet the further mystery of resolution. How is the evil then explained to meet its end? And what, if any, is that end? Binding the two queries together is the immediate problem of how we are to understand and cope with the many dimensions of evil in personal and social history. Protology and eschatology, separated in theoretical time, are woven together as underlying assumptions in interpretations of evil within ordinary time. The assumptions so broadly sketched above can be developed for personal history, for group history, and for all of history. Two basic concepts radically affect the development of these assumptions: freedom and finitude. While the two concepts are interrelated, they are not necessarily reciprocal. The freedom which can be exercised toward evil is invariably considered a finite freedom, whereas finitude may or may not entail a notion of freedom. When it does, then the tension between freedom and finitude involves the primacy accorded to one of them as the root cause of evil. Radically different interpretations of God and the overcoming of evil follow from the dominance given one concept over the other. When freedom bears the great weight in accounting for evil, then the subjective will becomes the root cause of evil, either within history or in proto-history. Resolution to evil within history depends upon a corrected will, which becomes an anticipation of eschatological harmony. However, given the unmitigated responsibility of the subjective will in creating the problem of evil in the first place, the eschatological harmony might well entail an everlasting punishment for the reluctant, or the recalcitrant will. The God who metes out such punishment is a God of balance and measure, of grace and judgment, acting freely from a divine will which invariably wills the good, bringing it about in God's own time. When finitude is the primary problem, then existence is its own reason for evil, and all resolutions to evil in history are but partial triumphs against the greater tragedy of time. The finitude will, or the finite will, is but one contributor to the problem of evil. And even were that will pure, evil in the form of suffering would yet be encountered. When finite existence is viewed as created existence, then the problems for theology move into theodicy, or the justification of God in the face of unnecessary evil in creation. Atheism, or reassessment of divine power and goodness, then frequently crowd the theological agenda. Resolution to the problem of evil hangs in the balance. Since the cause of the problem is no longer the sole responsibility of the finite will, the divided eschatology of punishment/salvation no longer addresses the problem. Evil is only fully resolved in a post-historical universal salvation. But the notion of God, now brought into question by the primacy of finitude, may no longer provide such an eschatology. The thesis of this work is that the contemporary era is one in which the notion of finitude is fundamental to the problem of evil, not to the exclusion of freedom, but as setting parameters that necessarily restrict the exercise of freedoms. This differs from the long dominant Augustinian tradition in which the original misuse of freedom sets freedom's subsequent parameters. If we have now shifted to the primacy of finitude, then the Augustinian eschatological resolution of evil must also be revised. Evil rooted in a wayward will may be balanced eschatologically by a judgment that divides eternally, but evil rooted in finitude must be met with an eschatology of some ultimate reconciliation of all things. In the process, of course, the doctrine of God must be rigorously redeveloped. This work studies the relation of freedom and finitude to the problem of evil as developed by Augustine and Leibniz, respectively. Having set the tension between the two concepts, we then explore the development of the problem of evil and its end in four major thinkers: Kant, who returns to radical evil in the will; Schleiermacher, who further develops the implications of evil and finitude. Hegel, who resolves evil as finitude, as it is taken into the infinite, and Nietzsche, who proclaims the end to the ability to resolve the problem, save through embracing it as one's fate, ultimately leading to nihilism. Continuing, through the philosophical categories of Alfred North Whitehead, we pick up the challenge to address the problem anew. Whitehead's concept of reality and his process metaphysics, as rhythmically both subjective and objective, allows a balanced tension between freedom and finitude whereby each conditions the other and both together provide the dynamic root of evil. Insights gained from Augustine and Leibniz, Kant and Schleiermacher, Hegel and Nietzsche are then woven into the Whiteheadian conceptuality in order to offer a comprehensive vision of the end of evil in process eschatology. It is also the thesis of this work that interpretations of protology and eschatology have their historical importance primarily as they influence our reasoned responses to contemporary problems. Thus, the work of developing a process eschatology in historical context is not for the sake of abstract flights of fancy, not simply to press the limits of a conceptual system of thought. Rather, formulations of reasons and ends become a shaping power of naming, energizing anew the zeal to contribute to all of Earth's well-being in history's ordinary time. End of introduction. And now to read the conclusion, the end of evil. Our journey has taken us through initial explorations into two formulations of the root of evil, freedom and finitude. For both Augustine and Leibniz, the issue was not only to understand the root problem of evil, but to formulate powerful visions depicting the end of evil. For Augustine, this end involved a balancing of the cosmos in a perfect harmony, which depended upon an eternal punishment of those who marred the glory of God's creation, whether angelic or human. Perhaps out of this thinking came the eternal conscious torment doctrine and also original sin. On the other hand, for Leibniz, the end was as creation, whether it was as ambiguous as the source. For all of his attempts to reformulate an argument that the freedom of the will created the problem of evil, his actual development indicated the problem of finitude. His expression of evil's end likewise has a share of ambiguity. For those violators of God's order will indeed receive punishment, and this punishment will be meted out in a city of God, akin to Augustine's vision. But unlike Augustine, Leibniz saw no separation of the damned and the redeemed, but rather envisioned them together in the city, which is finally the pre-envisioned harmony of God. Kant, with his emphasis on the will, postulated a realm of immortality which would finally yield the happiness which should be attended upon the moral will. He too visualized a city which was a kingdom of ends and an ethical commonwealth where there would be at last a union of hearts. This city was the earthly goal of human existence, but the implications remain as an Augustine enlightenment of an immortal city. Schleiermacher, Hegel, and Nietzsche variously expressed the problem of evil in terms of finitude, and each gave his own variation on the precise nature of evil's effects and the envisioned resolution to evil's ills. Whether in completion to all existence through the incarnate Redeemer, as in Schleiermacher, or through an ultimate realization of absolute spirit in and through human self-consciousness, as in Hegel, or in the darker projections of Nietzsche's Amor Fatale, or an eternal recurrence, each posed the hope of evil's end. With such a legacy, a process theologian must continue the journey by utilizing the both and, as opposed to an either or, nature of process thought. Both freedom and finitude qualify a process world, and evil is related to both, and conditioned by both. Evil, or the destruction of well-being in a variety of modes, follows from the fragility of interdependent existence, where the structure of internal relationships involves all existence in vulnerability. Within this vulnerability, the exercise of freedom has multiple effects, some of which will be inevitably experienced as contributing to well-being from a particular standpoint, but as detracting from or destroying a well-being from another. There is a fundamental ambiguity to existence with good and evil interwoven. The ambiguity is intensified since the very structure which yields evil is precisely the structure which yields redemption. The vulnerability which forms the fragility of existence is the means for creating not only the richness of existence, but the very reality of existence. To exist is to be involved in internal relationships, open to and vulnerable to the energies of the past, and affecting the reality of the future. There is dependence upon the past and responsibility towards the future. And in this web of relationality, both good and evil find ambiguous expressions. In the process analysis, God also must be portrayed as involved in the relational structure of existence. God, as well as the world, is internally affected by that which is other. God, as well as the world, has an effect on the ongoing reality of temporal existence. Insofar as God is everlastingly one, then God everlastingly receives the world into the divine nature, transforming the unifying, and unifying the world within the richness of the primordial vision. Consequent upon this process, God offers back to the world possibilities for its own transformation. These possibilities reflect the divine image insofar as they lead the world toward a rich diversity of communities of well-being related to one another in harmony and peace. The possibilities reflect the world insofar as they are adapted to what is really possible in any locus. The dual reflection of God and the world in the possibilities means that what is actually possible will not be quote-unquote utopian, but it will be realizable, and if achieved will lead to new possibilities where the communal image of God will be even stronger. Whether these possibilities are actualized in time depends upon the free response of the world. Thus, the end of evil is its continuous transformation in God beyond all history, which then provides possibilities for particular transformations in time. Within the finitude of time, there can be neither full nor final perfection, and every good must look to its own transformation. This vision, like so many in our history, expresses the haunting hope of a city not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. And that city is the very reality of God. The city calls us to its reflection in the cities of time, so that history can mirror a reconciliation of things in a peace which works the well-being of earth and its inhabitants. Our freedom and our finitude paradoxically hinder the task, and yet, with the ever-present empowerment of God, make it possible. The expression of the end of evil in this volume has been developed primarily in philosophical categories rather than, say, strict theological categories. Although theological suppositions and implications have been woven throughout the presentation, it is then a natural theology that is foundationally Christian, in contrast to, say, a supernatural being classical theistic position. Continuing, it is built upon the assumption that God is a power for redemption of history's sorrows. It is a particular vision of the end of evil developed from a particular Christian standpoint, and therefore reflecting that standpoint. The mentor of all process theologians and philosophers speaks better than any of us to the hazards of attempting to envision the end of evil. Those shalls which cause our shipwrecks. Whitehead wrote in his own small gem, Immortality, of course, we are unable to conceive of the experience of the supreme unity of existence, but these are the human terms in which we can glimpse the origin of that drive towards limited ideals of perfection, which haunts the universe. This immortality of the world of action, derived from its transformation in God's nature, is beyond our imagination to conceive. The various attempts at description are often shocking and profane. What does haunt our imagination is that the immediate facts of present action pass into permanent significance for the universe. The insistent notion of right and wrong, achievement and failure depends upon this background. Otherwise, every activity is merely a passing whiff of insignificance. That which is beyond our imagination, nonetheless, infuses our lives with hope. With the vision, which is here so feebly expressed, will gladly yield to a more perfect knowledge of evil's end. And now to expand a little bit on the concept of freedom and finitude as causes of said evils. From chapter 2, page 32, I'm going to read a small section that I particularly enjoyed, and that's Schleiermacher's account. And we quote, "Through Kant, then, our contemporary age has received a powerful formulation of the problem of evil rooted in a corrupt will, and overcome by implications of an empowering divine action. The analogies with Augustine's classical understanding of the termed will are surely present in Kant, despite the profound differences. In classical thought, there is an emphasis upon an original purity from which the will has turned. Kant's depiction of moral failure is rested on no existential perfection achieved and lost. He uses the Adamic story not as the symbol of a lost past, but a symbolic portrayal of our own failures. This would be perhaps a more mythic or mystical interpretation of the Genesis account of the fall. Continuing, the moral law exists as an archetypal goal, impelling persons toward achievement of the goal of universal moral rectitude. Thus, redemption cannot at all be a turning of the will back to an original direction. It must be a novel overcoming of an existential and historical misdirection. If Kant gave a modern expression of Augustine's emphasis on the evil will, his near contemporary Friedrich Schleiermacher repeated themes more clearly continuous with the emphasis upon finitude given in Leibniz. Schleiermacher bypassed Kant's separation of evil and the world of nature and developed an understanding based not only upon finitude, but upon the emerging notions of a developing, evolving world. Enter science. Kant spoke of the capacity for the moral law as something imposed upon nature, and therefore as discontinuous with the natural world. Schleiermacher saw his version of our spiritual being, that is, the God consciousness, as emerging from our sensuous and rational or natural nature in a continuous development which leads to our completion, and through us to the completion of the world. And I would say this in many ways aligns with Ken Wilber's spectrum of consciousness development in his psychological theories of consciousness development from one stage to the next. This God consciousness relates to the evolution of the world, to evil, and to redemption. In these respects, the awareness of the interdependence of all finite beings in an antithesis of dependence and freedom is of primary importance in the God consciousness. Ultimately, this awareness of interdependence is itself dependent upon the overcoming of the finite antithesis in the feeling of absolute dependence. Following the discussion of interdependence, therefore, we will explore its relation to the feeling of absolute dependence. Schleiermacher has a teleological view of the world's development, wherein the thrust toward the God consciousness is the driving force. And this is also, I would say, akin to Pierre Teilhard de Chardin's evolutionary theism or theistic evolution, and the driving force being that towards the arrival of the omega point, or Christ consciousness, or God consciousness, as Schleiermacher calls it, as being the driving force in the creative evolution of the world. Continuing, in the pre-spiritual sensuous beginnings of existence, there is an unconscious interdependence among the beings in the world as existence develops towards consciousness. It does so toward the end that this interdependence and the further absolute dependence of all finite beings upon God will become recognized. Once recognized, this state of dependence is to become the criterion for conscious action. And so therefore, there won't, at this point in the God consciousness, become a separate conscious action of free will, apart from any state of dependence upon God. Continuing, since the world is pushing towards such a state, the world as such is good. The sensuous nature alone is not evil in and of itself, but the transition from such a state of primordial innocence in the world to one of evil, sin, and guilt lies in the change which spirituality brings about in existence. The position of a spiritual creature in the whole of nature is first that of an integral part of the whole, and the second is that part of creation which through knowledge is to bind that creation into a meaningful as well as factual system of interrelationships. The creation is to receive a coherence and cohesiveness with the advent of human spirituality, or its emergence, so to speak, in the full evolution of the world towards that God consciousness, or according to Teilhard, its omega point towards Christ consciousness. The creation is to receive a coherence and cohesiveness with the advent of human spirituality, through which the creation overcomes fragmentation and is unified through recognized interdependence and mutual absolute dependence. Obviously, then, this God consciousness is to determine the attitude toward the world, but in doing so, it requires a responsiveness which is obtained in the pre-spiritual condition. The pre-spiritual responsiveness centers primarily on the preservation of the responding organism, either as an individual or as a species. In such a case, the interrelatedness of the aspects of the world are irrelevant to the participants in the world, save as this interrelatedness is unconsciously utilized for the preservation of each being. And Carl Jung comes to mind in his lectures concerning the unconscious and the conscious aspects of being. Absolute dependence may be a fact of existence, but it is not yet a feeling, not a determining element of conscious existence. The emergence of a spiritual being is completely antithetical to this situation, for instead of requiring a concentration on the interests of one physical organism, spiritual being requires a reversal of perspective in which a new dimension emerges in the constitution of a being. In the pre-spiritual form of existence, survival of the organic unity is a sufficient determiner of action and or being. But in the spiritual form, a self emerges, which many have called the higher self, or the God self, which is only developed by its conscious relationship to all being, and an expansiveness which must include all others in itself. This consciousness becomes the basis of its active being. The resistance of the sensuous nature to the spirit is located just here. Pardon me for that interruption. I had to pause. I had a call come in. Okay, so we'll continue where we left off. The resistance of the sensuous nature to the spirit is located just here in this reversal of what it is that constitutes the welfare of being. The self-centeredness, which was natural and proper in the pre-spiritual sphere, has given rise to the center of consciousness. But now, a continuation in self-centeredness works against the best interests of that consciousness. Thus, the limitations that Schleiermacher saw imposed upon the animal nature do not have that aura of arbitrariness as in Kant, but are limitations that emerge from that lower nature in order to bring it and the whole creation to a higher state. And this aligns also with a form of resurrection theology for all of creation as well, or universal reconciliation of some sort. Continuing, the problem in sin then is not only nor indeed chiefly that the sensuous nature, or that which is purely natural, is ahead of the spiritual by virtue of its precedence in time, but that the spiritual nature to which the sensuous has given rise must now transcend the sensuous inclinations toward exclusive and self-centered existence in favor of an inclusive and outward directed intention, rather than strictly self-centered. The complicating factor is that this new mode of being must take place not in a radical break with the sensuous nature, but in a continuity which simply directs one's sensuous nature toward the requirements of this new end. The emergence of the spiritual signifies the selfhood which must break the bonds of a now false exclusiveness. Without spiritual consciousness, self-centeredness seems, or at least is proper. With spirituality, the actual interrelatedness of all things demands a response to the world, which is a willing participation in the giving and receiving within the world, which transcends the individual. Without spirituality, there is no, per se, perception of evil, no sin, no guilt. With spirituality, there is immediate involvement in all three. It can easily be seen that in this understanding of an emerging consciousness, evil and sin are rooted in the temporal frame, and the spatial individualization of existence, in which case the root of evil is finitude, but that, nevertheless, all evil is to be regarded as the punishment of sin, but only social evil as directly such, and natural evil as only indirectly. Evil is now whatever obstructs the effectiveness of the God consciousness, so that evil, while rooted in finitude and nature, or natural inclinations, or sensuality, in a strict sense, is still dependent upon the reaction to that finitude obstructive situation, or to that finite obstructive situation. which is perhaps one reason why the adversarial Satan in the Bible is also called obstructor or an obstructor. Continuing, because of God consciousness, we are obligated to subsume the potentially destructive situation into conformity with the God consciousness. Insofar as we succeed, evil never materializes. But insofar as we fail, our failure, by definition, actualizes the obstructiveness of the situation. Evil is relative to our ability to wield our God consciousness, or a lack thereof, in relationship to the world. Within this understanding, there is no sense in which nature becomes quote-unquote fallen from a former perfection due to human sin. Rather, nature as well as humanity is simply hindered in its press toward completion through the God consciousness. Schleiermacher has performed the admirable feat of treating evil as rooted in finitude rather than solely in human freedom, which is where much of the classical theistic orthodox doctrines are rooted. And yet, establishing that evil is human responsibility despite the finitude, since it comes about in our failure towards ourselves and world, and not, as many atheists propose, to put the blame of those evils and failures upon God. How does an overcoming of evil fit this understanding? Schleiermacher portrays the Redeemer as the culmination and completion of creation. But this occurs in a curiously twofold sense, both from within the creation and from without. In Christ, there is a different union of creation and creator than that which follows normally from God's constant creativity in the world. Christ's person is both an emergence from nature, by which there is a continuity between Jesus and the creation, and a direct infusion by God of the consciousness of the interrelatedness of all being. With this consciousness beings of such a strength that it is a sufficient determiner of all Christ's actions. The necessity of such a being is the final inability of creation in and of itself to attain its own completion or final redemption, or primordial concrescence in God. It is as if God had been working through creation, propelling it toward the culmination of development, which is the creation's becoming conscious of itself and God in spirituality and or religions. But that the creation cannot itself make the transition from fragmentation in the individual centeredness of its parts to the wholeness, which is the gift of spiritual consciousness. Its resistance comes not in its sensuousness, but at the very point of a God consciousness, which nevertheless continues in the dominance of the sensuous mode of being. And therefore, in many ways, the ego resists spiritual awakening because of this. It had its resistance to its own awakening, because that would entail somewhat, I would say, of a shock from say, awakening from a dream state to full conscious awareness, which is technically what enlightenment and spiritual awakening or ego death entails. It's not, in most cases, a particularly comfortable ride. Continuing, the awareness of interdependence and absolute dependence is achieved, but the conformity of action with this awareness wavers in a hiatus created by habit, proceeding only feebly and partially to the fulfillment of the destiny which it claims. In Christ, then, who himself has been born through the route of humanity, God acts not only indirectly from within the creation, but now directly upon creation. Christ becomes the bestowal upon humanity of that fullness of God consciousness toward which the creation had been straining. Consequently, Christ is both the completion and the correction of creation, particularly, of course, at the point of difficulty, humanity. In Christ, creation is perfected, and the magnetism of this perfection draws all creation into a participation in this perfection, which is now its own by virtue of Christ's humanity. His perfection achieved within an interrelated system of nature reverberates to the benefit of every participant in that system. And I would say whether the participant is aware or unaware of this all-pervading Christ consciousness. So, in Sukoki's approach, her historical approach to evil and process eschatology, we can conceive of a rather coherent theodicy and actually envision how evil may end, or at least be maximally minimized in the world in which we live. So from a philosophical perspective, and not merely theological, she deals with evil as she presents each viewpoint from Augustine, Leibniz, Kant, Schleiermacher, Hegel, and Nietzsche, and summarizes how we may answer these great thinkers of the past and utilize and perhaps move forward towards a more coherent perception of why evil tends to persist in God's good world. So that's the summary of The End of Evil, Process Eschatology in Historical Context by Marjorie Hewitt Sukoki. If you care to investigate further into this reading, I would recommend that you pick up the book and read it. It's extremely, and I would say it's complex and enlightening as well. There are a few sections in it that I struggled to understand, but nonetheless, conceptualizing Whitehead's metaphysics isn't altogether simple either. So I'm still doing my best to grasp that worldview as well. So from the process perspective, the Odyssey seems to come out on top as far as that. Most adequate explanation for the persistence or the problem, or what has been called the problem of evil in theology. Thank you for listening.